Are you a healthcare professional looking for a trusted concussion resource? Then you've come to the right place. From her New York City studios, welcome to Concussion Corner with your host, Dr. Jessica Schwartz.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Did you know that sport helmets are rated on a 5-star system similar to cars? And the safest helmets have nothing to do with price, brand, or availability? Since 2011, Virginia Tech researchers have been providing unbiased helmet ratings that allow consumers to make informed decisions when purchasing helmets. The helmet ratings are the culmination of over a decade of research identifying which helmets best reduce concussion risk. This work is done as part of Virginia Tech's service mission and is 100% independent of any funding or influence from helmet manufacturers. Our mission at Concussion Corner is to expose you, the listener, to trusted spaces in the concussion arena that translate to clinic next day. Please visit the Virginia Tech Helmet Lab website in our show notes or at bit.ly/Virginia Tech Helmets and spread the word to aid in lowering concussion risk in your community. Thank you for tuning in, and let's begin the show. Hello, and welcome to Season 5 of Concussion Corner. My name is Dr. Jessica Schwartz, and this is a special Concussion Corner short highlighting Brain Injury Awareness Month for the month of March in 2023. The month of March is not only Women's Month, it's also Brain Injury Awareness Month. And this hashtag for Brain Injury Awareness Month is More Than My Brain Injury. So I encourage you all to reach out, contact us, interact, and engage with us on social media. We can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and we cannot wait to hear your unique stories of More Than My Brain Injury. This is a podcast dedicated to rehabilitative professionals doing the research and both being clinician scientists and those that are troops on the ground actually treating concussion as a rehabilitative injury. So without further ado, I cannot wait to highlight Dr. Katie Hunzinger and her research from the CARE Consortium on baseline data for rugby players. Without further ado, More Than My Brain Injury Awareness Month. Let's meet Dr. Katie Hunzinger. Katie Hunzinger is a postdoctoral researcher working under Dr. Andrea Schneider at the University of Pennsylvania-Perelman School of Medicine. She completed her undergraduate work in kinesiology at Northern Illinois University, where she was a member of the women's rugby team. She received her master's degree in health and exercise science at Wake Forest University, where she also received certification as a clinical exercise physiologist. She continued to work for Wake Forest on multiple randomized clinical trials before moving to Delaware to complete her PhD in Biomechanics Movement Sciences at the University of Delaware. Her research focuses on concussion and subsequent musculoskeletal injury, as well as long-term outcomes of repetitive head impact exposure among male and female collision sport athletes. Outside of her work, she is a USA Rugby referee, a World Rugby Educator and referee for strength and conditioning, and a CrossFit coach. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Hunzinger.
Thank you so much for having me, Jess.
It's so great to have you on. You know, I've been a longtime fan and kind of watching you progress through your career all the way through a postdoc, and we're so happy to have you on Concussion Corner podcast.
No, it's a privilege to be here. Same here. I've watched your podcast grow.
Yeah, it's nuts. And we're so fortunate to have our sponsor re-sponsor us. It's Virginia Tech Helmet Lab with Dr. Stefan Duma. So we hope that actually gets information out to the general public and to clinicians. And we're so happy to actually highlight in our first podcast of 3 actually with you. This is going to be our Concussion Corner short. We're going to highlight your new CARE Consortium study that you just had published in the BMJ Military Health Journal, baseline concussion assessment performance by sex in military service academy rugby players, findings from the CARE Consortium. And I'm so happy to break this down with you.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you again for having me.
Yeah. So, you know, as we highlight this one article before we go into your career and some more of your work in episodes 2 and 3 with you here for future, I'd love to kind of just get a little background of, you know, why rugby? How did you entree into this research realm? And let's get after it.
Yeah. So why rugby is a great question. So I played rugby in college and I still contract for USA Rugby. I met my spouse through rugby. So it's clearly a large part of my world. I never intended it to be a research foray for me. it was one of those things, random conversation over coffee one morning at the office with my advisor, Tom Buckley, during my doctorate, where I said, rugby is the only collision sport where men and women play by the same laws. And he was like, what? And I'm like, yeah, lacrosse, it's different. Ice hockey, it's different. There's really not a mass women's American football league. And so we were like, wait, we can do something with this. And due to some grant funding and everything like that, we changed my dissertation anyway. And we said, well, let's go rugby. And, it was a win-win for me. I was like, I get to study something I love. And this really fills a unique niche because it permits this insight into sex differences on how men and women respond to neurotrauma because they're having that same exposure. And that just led to my dissertation, and that's kind of been my continued research line. So it's quite ironic because I remember graduating college and saying, I'm not going to make my identity rugby. I need to do things beyond rugby. I'm not going to be some pro rugby player. There's no money in rugby. I'm not going anywhere with this. And then the irony that my entire research line has kind of become rugby has not left me.
That's awesome. And that's so fascinating too about the laws being, this is the only sport where they're equal 1-to-1.
Yeah, only collision sport. Yeah.
Collision sport. That's
yeah. So soccer, obviously it's the same, baseball, softball, et cetera. But yeah, the only collision sport.
That's fascinating. And in terms of, did you have any backlash? Or did anybody say, hey, this isn't, we don't need this data, or were people welcoming open arms and let's get after it?
Yeah, in terms of the baseline paper, I had some struggle finding a home. And I think that's really because you have, so in care, the only varsity rugby players were at the service academies. And typically there's less than 40 varsity women's rugby programs nationwide. They're trying to get 40 so that they can achieve NCAA status. And there's definitely, 2 or 3 dozen varsity men's program, but predominantly they're clubs. So they're not university funded. Mm-hmm. And so the service academies like West Point, they are varsity for men and women. They still are club at Navy and some of the other schools. And so, you had this weird mix of, okay, so these are military midshipmen and cadets, but they're athletes. And so do we go to a military journal? Well, they don't want that because they're athletes. And then do we go to an athlete journal, a sports medicine journal? And they're going to say, well, we don't want that. These are military service members. And so it took us a while to find a home because it was definitely like, well, we don't need this because we don't care about rugby or we don't care about, military. We're athlete focused. So that was a struggle to find it a home. And I'm glad we finally found it a home.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, and for those of our listeners that don't know, the CARE Consortium is an endeavor to provide necessary infrastructure and scientific expertise to study concussion. And what's fascinating is that, 2014 was the first year that Dr. Brian Hainline was actually put forth as the chief medical officer of the NCAA. And with this study, through the NCAA and DoD, Department of Defense, there's been over 53,000 plus students and cadets and midshipmen that have been enrolled in this study across 26 schools and 4 U.S. service academies, over 100 plus sports and activities, which include rugby, it's not just football, which is great to see things being studied with controls. And they've actually documented over 5,500 injuries of concussion. So in terms of having access to that data, of course, we don't want to, give people head injuries, into the fact that we can study this kind of, knowing that about 1 in 4 adults have had a concussion or know someone that has had a concussion. So get access to this data to study it is just so exciting for me to kind of see folks like yourself just trying to just help for the long term.
Yeah, I think that's the really great thing about the CARE Consortium as well is, once you're in and you have a connection to either one of the principal investigators or the site investigators, they are more than welcoming to anyone coming in with a research question and trying to answer it with the data. And so that's been really great to be a part of that.
Well, that's awesome to hear. And let's kind of like open this article up for our folks, and we'll have everything like links and everything in the show notes. But why care? Why did you bring this to care first? Because I know we talked a little bit about club. I went to Ithaca College, and they had club rugby over there. Go Bombers. But why care, and why rugby, and why were these two things important for your data collection?
There you go. In the small world of rugby, I know the men's rugby coach at Ithaca, a good friend of mine. But so why care? So really, it was the data were collected for me. So that made my life really easy. It was right off the bat, the data were there. And I was not going to match the numbers doing a study in the area. So, I could have utilized the University of Delaware men and women's rugby teams, and I would have been lucky to get maybe 30 or 40. And so, in this study alone, I had 600. And so there was just no way I was going to get that much numbers doing any other study in the greater Philadelphia area, especially not without a large buy-in from those teams or universities. And that would have involved a lot of travel.
Yeah. And I think we also spoke about that. It's also the only one that has varsity rugby as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you had these varsity programs at West Point, and, I can't even think like the nearest women's varsity program to Philadelphia is probably AIC. They have a varsity, and Westchester actually. So about 30 minutes away from here. So Westchester does have a varsity program, but again, so you're kind of limited for access. And then, so CARE had it for me, and I was like, well, great, let's look at this.
Right. So let's talk about the study. And, I know you have over 600 N for your rugby playing, your N for the study. And the acronym here is SAM, for Service Academy members. So if folks hear that, they'll know exactly what we're talking about. But let's talk about how you kind of set the study up, what tools were used, and let's talk about outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. So the impetus of the study was really the fact that, like we said, there's not that many varsity programs. And so the downside of not being varsity means you don't have resources, right? You don't have a physical therapist, you don't have an athletic trainer, you don't have a team doctor. And so you're a club team, and maybe the school gives you $500 a semester to help buy some mouth guards or some rugby balls, and that's it. And so as a result, if they are lucky enough to have like a Go for Ellis rents an athletic trainer on a Saturday for a game, their athletic trainer has never met them before. They've never worked with them before. And really because it's not governed by the NCAA, they don't fall under the medical guidelines either. And so depending what state you live in, you can have completely different coverage requirements. So in the state of Pennsylvania for rugby, for club rugby, whether that's, University of Delaware playing in Pennsylvania, the requirement is either a cell phone to call 911 or a physician. And 11 times out of 10, it's a cell phone, and sometimes it's, Jim on the team's an athletic training major, so he's going to tape ankles for us. And so there's really not great medical coverage. And for me as a referee, it's a blessing if they have an athletic trainer. But the downside, again, is they know nothing. So they don't know what their baseline is. They've never met this individual before. They don't know if they typically report symptoms at baseline or how their reaction speed is or how they're performing. And so that's kind of why I wanted to do this study, is provide an American data set of collegiate rugby players. Let's see how they're performing at baseline. And then also the nice thing was just being able to look at those sex differences, again, between male and female, because these are rugby players. They're having the same exposure, they're experiencing the same number of head impacts per match. And so, how are they performing differently? Because you don't get to compare male to female in the CARE Consortium for football. And so this was a nice way to kind of get at that sex differences.
Interesting. And before we hop into some of the tools that were used to measure some baseline data, I want to really harp here why rugby is so important, because I even know that in Canada, there's even like conversations about actually canceling girls rugby altogether, just because there have been so many injuries and actually some deaths that have been recorded. When we think of folks like Rowan Stringer, may she rest in peace. Gordon is, on Twitter, and we follow him and support all of his legal fights that he's put through Canada for concussion awareness. What are some numbers? I know we have some 3x numbers for rugby compared to things like football and other musculoskeletal injuries.
Yeah, so definitely. So yeah, I think it was Kate Van Pelt came out with a great paper a couple years ago, and we can link that in the show notes. I can send that to you after. Basically looking at, concussion risk by sport, and rugby was the highest, and number 2 was football, and rugby was a rate 3 times higher than that of American football. And so that's very telling. And obviously, the demands of the game are different, right? In football, you're one player out of plenty on the field, and 9 times out of 10, you're not involved in a tackle. Maybe you're blocking, so you still have that repetitive head impacts, but you're really not, and then half the game you're on the sidelines, and so rugby, for 80 minutes, you've got 15 against 15 playing against each other. You're completing, if not assisting, in multiple tackles every game. So you're not having those like little blocking repetitive head impacts, but you're having either high velocity, high speed tackles, or low velocity, low speed tackles all throughout the game with no breaks. And so fatigue is going to be a factor too. So now that beautiful tackle you made in the first minute certainly doesn't look like that in the 75th minute of the match. And so the exposures are completely different between football and rugby. And I'd have to imagine that fatigue is a large contributor to why we see a lot of injuries. And there is some data, Ross Tucker's had some good data from World Rugby showing some higher injury rates, in the 3rd and 4th quarters, if you will, of the game. And that is the same for musculoskeletal injury. And the musculoskeletal injury rates are about 3 times that higher of American football. And, that's why I did my other study where I looked at concussion and musculoskeletal injury in rugby players. And so, the fact that they're having all these injuries, but nobody's looking at them in the States, that is doing them a disservice, really, because they have all these injuries. And then you add on top of that they typically don't have sports medicine coverage. It's just insult to injury. And we're throwing them to the wolves. And so, we need to try to make sports safer. Nobody wants to stop sport because the physical activity and health benefits component, not to mention, social and mental wellness benefits. But, there's got to be a way that we can make sports safer and lower those injury rates, whether it is, musculoskeletal, concussion, or repetitive head impacts.
Exactly. And I'm even just thinking some of, Steve Brolio out of Michigan. I'm even just thinking of some of his data he's presented, with over 500 and close to 530,000 impacts. And they're looking at about 72% of concussions are happening in football practice or happening in practice. So about 3/4 if you look at that. And it'd be actually interesting to have somebody track that data for the rugby, as well, just because, can we diminish head impact exposure, kind of in chunks? And if it's not in the game, can we do it in practice? So it'd be interesting to see that kind of grow.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the direction rugby is going to head. Similar, like we've seen in, soccer in the UK, we've got legislation for, no soccer heading before age 12. And so I think you're going to see rugby kind of go in that same direction. Again, we're not trying to cancel it and ban the sport, but how do we limit these head impacts if they're not necessary?
Right. All right. Well, let's chat a little bit about, we'll finish up the paper here because we're going to try to keep this to a concussion corner short. So in the methods, we see that you guys use the SCAT, which is the Sport Concussion Assessment Tool, and symptom severity checklist. You use the SAC, which is this standard assessment of concussion. And then you use an impact computerized neurocognitive test, and then the ANAM, which is the automated neuropsychological assessment metric. And then from that, what were the results of your study?
Yeah, so that was the nice thing about CARE, is that we had all these outcomes that we can use at our disposal. And so really the only significant differences that we found were between the sexes on symptoms, which is consistent with what we've seen across the literature, where women tend to report higher symptoms and greater symptom severities at baseline. Now, those numbers really weren't clinically significant. Again, when you have an N of 600 plus, you start to just kind of diminish the effects. And so the effect sizes were very, very small. For instance, for the symptoms, women reported 3.3 versus 2.8 symptoms for men. So not even a whole 1 point of symptoms, right? You can't have a 0.8 of a symptom. And so, to have a 0.5 difference in symptom count really isn't clinically significant. I think that was just a power thing. And same with that symptom severity. It was about 5.7 versus 4.3. So at least 1 point higher, but again, just a very small effect size. So nothing crazy. And then women performed a little bit worse on visual memory and impact as well, but no differences on SAC, no differences on ANAM. And the reason the academies use ANAM is that's what the military uses. So anyone in the military in the United States, they do take that ANAM test as essentially a baseline, so that when they deploy, it's a field tool that they can use to help assess potential TBI when deployed. And so we didn't really find many differences, especially any differences that were there were very clinically insignificant.
Okay. And then in terms of what this study adds to, this incremental data, right? We need to kind of catch this incremental data to make steps, in concussion and TBI research. We understand that there have been 0 phase 3 clinical trials for the traumatic brain injury in the last 3 decades, almost 4 decades now. There's over 43 working definitions of concussion, and one of them is evidence-based. And we have to kind of connect to, what am I looking at so we know what we're looking for? And that's me, the clinician, Dr. Schwartz, speaking, because I'm in clinic, right, treating patients as a physical therapist. So it's so fascinating to just kind of see this incremental marks on a checklist, right? And then remembering that next day knowledge translation does not usually happen with white paper dissemination or research. It takes 8 to 17 years. So what are you hoping to add with this study, and in hope where you kind of will take some of the future data?
Yeah, exactly. I really just want to see this progress. So I want to, go down the road and see how they change over seasons from rugby, and how does this affect the symptomology? Because again, you can look at that sex differences. So that's their baseline. How do they perform after 4 years of playing collegiate rugby? Not to mention 4 years of stressor being at a military service academy. And so I think that's what's really unique about these service academies is, they're under a unique stressor that average college students probably aren't.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have to walk the straight and narrow. They can go home on Fridays and hang out with their friends. And, so it's very different stressors and environmental factors. And so I would love to replicate this actually in the university population and see how they compare to these service academy members. But again, I think the whole benefit is that now we at least have some reference data for our rugby players that these sports medicine professionals can use. And if anything, I hope the paper helps people realize that, these rugby players are at high risk for injury, and they're not getting that sports medicine coverage unless they're at the service academies. That is their privilege, that they have sports medicine coverage for all their club sports, all their varsity sports. But, the average college rugby player is lucky if they have a rent an athletic trainer on a Saturday.
Yeah. And I think that talks about 3 things, that I hope our listeners take away from this Concussion Corner short as we're about to wrap up. I hope they kind of, they pay attention to that athletes are tactical athletes as well. And that's part of this population that's being studied. I think that's so important because they are, while there are a lot of similarities and parallels, the tactical athlete is a little bit of a different animal than an NCAA athlete. I think talking about athletic trainers and continuity of care is so important. So continuity of care is, listen, Dr. Hunzinger, rugby players are a little weird. We love rugby players, but you guys are a little weird. I know you're shooting the boot. I know what's going on. I went to these
exactly
parties, 20 years back and, in college. And you really need to understand the baseline of who your player is that you're working with from not only game to game, but really from season to season. So you really want to know, hey, is this person a little off, especially because concussion is 360 all encompassing. It's a challenge of your IAM. So you really want to have someone who knows your IAM, and who better than an athletic trainer or a sports sports physio if you're in a different
Absolutely.
country. And then hopefully folks heard the word rugby potentially for the first time and hear that as a sport. And hopefully, again, for our brothers and sisters up in Canada, up north, hopefully that we're not taking away girls rugby up in Canada. And hopefully we can modify rules and, kind of adapt the sport to what that may be needed for up north. But again, I hope we can keep people moving. And I hope those are some things that our listeners learned, with your study here today.
Yeah, that's exactly it. How do we keep people moving? And that is the benefit of rugby, right? It's a low cost entry. You got cleats, you got a mouth guard, let's play. So in terms of access to resource, it's a great sport to allow people to participate as opposed to things like lacrosse or ice hockey or field hockey that warrant specialized equipment. So, anything that we can do to get people moving and active is great. But if we can do that while also making it safer, even better.
Yeah, and we're going to be highlighting some young TBI, our researchers on the podcast this year in 2023. And, just so folks understand, I heard this from Steve Brolio at NYU Concussions Conference the other day. And, he had this quote from Ryan Lilly stating that unwavering incremental change can create remarkable and monumental results. So now that we have this baseline data just starting, this N of 601, right? You got some data. How long did this paper take you from start to finish? And so just so people understand how painstaking this research is so that we can get, big data and we can make changes and change outcomes for people in the real world.
Oh my goodness, did that take a while? So
how many years?
So I'm just thinking, I initially put in the data request probably June of I probably started the data request. I'm looking at my computer now. I started the data request October of 2020. Mm-hmm. And by the time I got the data, we were looking at July of 2021. And then from actually going through and getting the manuscript out and approved by care authors and finding a home for it, because, sometimes it just sits in review limbo. For months. It got accepted February of 2023, and we had started our initial submissions in October of 2022. So start to finish, we're looking at 2.5 years. And this was data that was already out there, already collected, just needed to be analyzed and submitted.
Yeah. So I hope people connect to that. I hope people appreciate your work. I'm excited to kind of see where this goes over the next 3, 5, 10 years. And just thank you so much for your, contribution to the rugby community, to the care community, and to the concussion community. In terms of where folks can find you online, they're going to meet you a little bit more in depth in our parts 2 and 3 of these podcasts. Where can folks find you online and reach out to you professionally?
Definitely. Twitter is my go-to. That's where I meet half of my collaborators and colleagues in the field. So it's just at Katie Hunzinger, one word, and we can get connected that way.
Awesome. Well, we'll definitely have this podcast out shortly. I hope people appreciate it. It is Brain Injury Awareness Month, and we hope that folks are using the hashtag More Than My Brain Injury. And again, as part of the concussion community, thank you so much for your service, and we'll see you for next round.
Thank you so much, Jess. Pleasure being here.
Thank you for listening to the Concussion Corner, hosted by Dr. Jessica Schwartz. The information in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and not to be used as personal medical advice. Don't forget to follow us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at Concussion Corner.